I never believed that £5,000 could break a heart before it mended one. But on the morning the Duke of Ashford summoned me to his study alongside 3 women who wore more jewels than I had seen in my entire life, I learned that money, like love, reveals exactly who we are when we believe no one is watching. The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, drumming against the tall windows of Ashford Manor with a persistence that matched my own sleepless nights. I had been awake since before dawn, as always, laying fires in the grand rooms and preparing breakfast trays for a household that barely acknowledged my existence. My hands were red and raw from scrubbing, my black dress worn thin at the elbows, and my hair pulled back so tightly that my temples ached. I was 23 years old, and I looked older, the way poverty ages a woman faster than time ever could. I had been in service at Ashford Manor for nearly 5 years, ever since my father died and left my mother, my younger sister Rose, and me with nothing but debts and a crumbling cottage on the edge of the village. My mother had fallen ill shortly after, a sickness in her lungs that the doctor said would only worsen without proper medicine and rest, neither of which we could afford. Rose was 16 now, still too young to work in the grand houses, and she spent her days caring for our mother while I sent home every penny I could spare. It was never enough. It would never be enough. The Duke himself was a man I had seen only in passing during my years at the manor. He was tall and dark-haired, perhaps 35 years of age, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the permanent coldness that settled across his features like frost on glass. He had married young, they said, to a beautiful woman from London who had died suddenly 6 months ago under circumstances that the servants whispered about in corners but never spoke of directly. Since her death, the Duke had become even more withdrawn, spending his days locked in his study or riding alone across his vast estates, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, was the true mistress of Ashford Manor. She was an ancient woman, thin as paper and twice as sharp, who ruled the household from her suite of rooms on the 2nd floor. It was said she had been a great beauty in her youth and had married for love rather than duty, a scandal at the time that had softened into legend over the decades. She was dying now. Everyone knew it, though she refused to acknowledge the fact and continued to issue orders and manage the estate as if she would live forever. That morning, I had just finished polishing the silver in the breakfast room when Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, found me and told me in a voice tight with disapproval that I was wanted in the Duke's study immediately. She looked at me as if I had done something wrong, though I could not imagine what. I had been careful, always careful, to keep my head down and my hands busy, to be invisible in the way that good servants were supposed to be. I followed her through the long corridors of the manor, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and windows that looked out onto gardens gone wild with neglect. My heart was beating too fast, and my hands were trembling slightly as I smoothed down my apron. Servants were not summoned to the Duke's study unless there was trouble, and I could not think of any mistake I had made, any rule I had broken. The study was a dark room lined with books, smelling of leather and tobacco and old wood. A fire burned in the hearth despite the relative warmth of the late spring morning, and the Duke stood before it with his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. 3 women sat in chairs arranged before his massive desk, and they turned to look at me as I entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. They were ladies, all 3 of them, dressed in gowns of silk and lace that probably cost more than I would earn in 10 years. The first was blonde and delicate, with pale blue eyes and a sweet smile that did not quite reach those eyes. The second was dark-haired and striking, with a proud tilt to her chin and emeralds at her throat that caught the firelight. The third was auburn-haired and voluptuous, her gown cut lower than was entirely proper, her lips painted a shade of red that I had only seen on actresses and women of questionable reputation. They looked at me the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a drawing room. Mrs. Hartley gestured for me to stand near the door, then left, closing it behind her with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The Duke did not turn around. For a long moment, no one spoke, and I could hear only the rain against the windows and the crackling of the fire and my own quick, shallow breathing. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice low and rough, as if he had not used it much in recent days. He said that his grandmother, in her infinite wisdom and stubbornness, had insisted upon a most unusual arrangement. He said that he had no intention of remarrying, that his late wife had cured him of any romantic notions he might once have harbored, but that the Dowager Duchess was convinced that he needed a new wife to secure the family line and manage the household. He said these things without emotion, as if he were discussing the purchase of livestock rather than his own future. The three ladies sat very still, their faces arranged in expressions of polite interest, though I could see the calculation in their eyes. They knew why they were here. They had come hoping to become the next Duchess of Ashford, to claim the title and the fortune and the power that came with it. Then the Duke turned around, and his eyes met mine for the first time, and I felt something cold move through my chest. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms, and they held no warmth at all. He said that his grandmother had one additional requirement, one final test, before he would even consider any of these women as potential brides. He said that he would give each of them £5,000, an enormous sum, and that they would have 1 week to spend it however they wished. At the end of the week, they would return and tell him what they had purchased, and he would judge them based on their choices. The blonde woman smiled and nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable request. The dark-haired woman looked pleased, her fingers already moving to touch the emeralds at her throat, as if imagining what other jewels she might acquire. The auburn-haired woman laughed softly, a sound like honey and smoke, and said that she could think of a dozen ways to spend such a sum. Then the Duke said something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. He said that there would be a fourth participant in this test, as per his grandmother's express wishes. He said that the Dowager Duchess had insisted that a woman of humble origins be included, someone who understood the value of money in a way that these fine ladies perhaps did not. He said that I, Margaret Thornton, would also receive £5,000 and would be judged alongside these three women of quality. The room erupted in protests. The blonde woman stood up, her sweet smile vanishing, saying that this was an outrage, that she would not be compared to a common maid. The dark-haired woman demanded to know if this was some kind of joke, if the Duke truly intended to insult them in this manner. The auburn-haired woman simply stared at me with narrowed eyes, as if I were a puzzle she could not quite solve. I could not move. I could not speak. £5,000 was more money than I had ever imagined holding, more than my father had earned in his entire life, more than I could earn in 20 years of service. It was enough to save my mother, to give Rose a dowry, to buy a small cottage where we could live without fear of hunger or cold or debt. It was enough to change everything. But I did not want to be part of this test. I did not want to be judged by this cold, bitter man who looked at me as if I were nothing, who had included me only because his dying grandmother had forced his hand. I did not want to compete with these women who hated me simply for existing in their presence. I wanted to return to the kitchens, to my work, to my invisible life where I was safe from notice and judgment. The Duke raised one hand and the protests stopped. He said that the decision was final, that anyone who refused to participate would be eliminated from consideration immediately. He said that we would each receive our money tomorrow morning and that we were to return in 1 week to present our purchases and explain our choices. He said that he expected us to be honest, that he would know if we lied, and that the consequences of dishonesty would be severe. Then he dismissed us, turning back to the fire as if we had already ceased to exist. The three ladies swept from the room in a rustle of silk and a cloud of expensive perfume, their faces tight with anger and indignation. I remained standing near the door, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The Duke spoke without looking at me. He said that I should not mistake his grandmother's generosity for his own approval, that he had no interest in marrying beneath his station, and that I was only included in this farce because the old woman was dying, and he could not refuse her final wishes. He said that I should spend the money wisely and not waste his time with sentimental nonsense. He said that I should leave now, that he had work to do. I left the study on legs that felt like water, my mind spinning with impossible thoughts. £5,000, enough to save my mother, enough to change our lives. But at what cost? What did it mean to be part of this test? To be judged by a man who clearly despised the very idea of me? What did the Duke truly want from us? What was he looking for? I spent the rest of that day in a fog, going through the motions of my work without really seeing or hearing anything around me. The other servants had already heard about the summons, of course, and they whispered behind their hands when I passed, their eyes full of speculation and jealousy and contempt. Mrs. Hartley told me coldly that I should not let this go to my head, that servants who forgot their place always came to bad ends, and that she would be watching me very carefully from now on. That night, I walked the 3 miles home to our cottage through the rain, my cloak soaked through and my boots caked with mud. My mother was sleeping, her breathing labored and rattling in her chest, and Rose met me at the door with fear in her young face. She said that the doctor had come again, that he had left more medicine but that it was not enough, that Mother was getting worse and that we needed to find a way to pay for better treatment, or she would not last the winter. I held my sister and told her that everything would be all right, though I did not know if I was lying or telling the truth. I told her about the £5,000, and she stared at me as if I had gone mad. She asked me what I would buy, what I would do with such an impossible sum, and I realized that I had no idea. I had spent my entire life thinking in terms of pennies and shillings, carefully measuring out every expense, never allowing myself to dream of anything beyond basic survival. £5,000 could buy medicine for my mother, real medicine from London, the kind that wealthy people used when they fell ill. It could buy food, real food, meat and bread and vegetables, enough to last us through the winter and beyond. It could pay off all of our debts, the ones that hung over us like storm clouds, threatening to take even our cottage if we fell too far behind. It could give Rose a chance at a better life, perhaps even a small dowry, so that she might marry someone kind who could take care of her. But the Duke had said he would judge us based on our choices. What did that mean? Did he want to see generosity or frugality? Wisdom or extravagance? Did he want a woman who would spend freely on beautiful things, or one who understood the value of money and spent it carefully? I had no way of knowing, no way of understanding what he was truly testing for. I lay awake that night in the narrow bed I shared with Rose, listening to the rain and my mother's labored breathing from the next room, trying to decide what to do. The 3 ladies would spend their money on jewels and gowns and perfumes, things that would make them more beautiful, more desirable, more worthy of becoming a duchess. They would return to the manor dripping with diamonds and silk, proof of their refined tastes and their understanding of what it meant to be a woman of quality. And I would return with what? Medicine and bread and the receipts for paid debts? Would that impress the Duke, or would it only confirm his belief that I was beneath his notice, a common girl with common concerns who could never understand the life he led? But I could not spend £5,000 on jewels and gowns, not when my mother was dying, not when Rose went to bed hungry more nights than not when our cottage was falling apart and winter was coming. I could not do it, even if it meant failing the Duke's test, even if it meant losing any chance of something more. I could not spend that money on anything but the things my family desperately needed. The next morning, I returned to the manor and found an envelope waiting for me in the servants' hall. Inside were banknotes, more money than I had ever seen, along with a brief note in an elegant hand that I recognized as belonging to the Duke's secretary. The note said simply that I had 1 week and that my choices would be evaluated based on wisdom, character, and understanding of true value. I put the money in my pocket, where it felt like a burning coal against my hip, and I went about my work with my mind elsewhere. I could feel the other servants watching me, could hear their whispers and sense their resentment. They thought I was putting on airs, that I believed myself better than them, now that I had been included in the Duke's strange test. They did not understand that I felt more afraid than honored, more burdened than blessed. That afternoon, I took my half-day and went into the village. I went first to the doctor's house, where I paid him 3 months in advance for the good medicine from London, the kind made with real herbs and compounds that might actually help my mother's lungs. He looked at me with surprise and suspicion, clearly wondering where a maid had gotten such money, but he took it and promised the medicine would arrive within the week. Then I went to the baker and bought enough flour and bread and grain to last us through the winter. I went to the butcher and bought salt pork and dried beef. I went to the greengrocer and bought potatoes and turnips and carrots that could be stored in our cellar. I went to the chandler and bought candles and lamp oil and soap. I paid the rent on our cottage for a full year in advance. I paid off all of my father's old debts, every penny we owed to every merchant in the village, until we were free of those shadows that had haunted us for so long. By the end of the day, I had spent nearly £4,000 on practical things, necessary things, things that would keep my family alive and safe and fed. I had £1,000 left, and for a moment I stood in the village square with the money in my hand, wondering if I should buy something else, something beautiful or extravagant that might impress the Duke. But I thought of Rose, who had never had a new dress in her life, who wore my old things cut down to fit her smaller frame. I thought of my mother, who had once been beautiful and who deserved to feel beautiful again before she died. I bought fabric for new dresses for both of them, good wool and cotton, nothing fancy but well made and warm. I bought my mother a shawl of soft blue that matched her eyes. I bought Rose a ribbon for her hair, a foolish extravagance that made me smile even as I counted out the coins. And I put the rest of the money away, hidden in our cottage where it would be safe, a cushion against future disasters and fears. The week passed slowly. I heard through the servants' gossip that the 3 ladies had returned to London for their shopping, that they had been seen at jewelers and dressmakers and perfumers, that they were spending money like water. The blonde woman had purchased a necklace of sapphires. The dark-haired woman had commissioned 3 new gowns from Paris. The auburn-haired woman had bought perfumes and silks and a set of matching ruby combs for her hair. I had bought bread and medicine and peace of mind. On the morning we were to return to the Duke's study, I put on my only good dress, black and plain, but clean and carefully mended. My mother was already looking better, the medicine working to ease her breathing. And Rose had hugged me tightly before I left, telling me that I had done the right thing, that she was proud of me. I carried that pride with me like armor as I walked back to the manor through the early morning mist, knowing that I would almost certainly fail this test, that I could never compete with women who knew how to be beautiful and desirable and worthy. But I had saved my mother's life, and surely, in any just world, that had to count for something. The 4 of us gathered once again in the Duke's study, and this time the 3 ladies looked at me with open disdain mixed with a hint of pity, as if they already knew I had failed before the test even began. The Duke did not look at any of us when we entered. He stood at the window with his back to the room, watching the mist roll across his estates like a gray sea, and for a long moment there was only silence broken by the rustle of expensive fabric and the quiet breathing of 4 women who had nothing in common except the judgment that awaited us all. The blonde woman spoke first, her voice bright and eager, like a child presenting a gift she knew would be admired. Her name was Lady Catherine Pembroke, I had learned from the servants, daughter of an earl and cousin to half the nobility in England. She described the sapphire necklace she had purchased, how it had once belonged to a French duchess, and how the jeweler had assured her it was worth twice what she had paid. She spoke of matching earrings she had commissioned, of a bracelet that would complete the set, of how the sapphires brought out the blue of her eyes, and how any man would be proud to see his wife wear such magnificent stones. The Duke said nothing. He did not turn from the window. Lady Catherine's voice faltered slightly, then grew more insistent, describing the craftsmanship and the history and the prestige of owning such jewels. When she finally fell silent, he simply nodded once, a barely perceptible movement of his dark head, and gestured for the next woman to speak. The dark-haired woman was Lady Victoria Ashworth, niece to a marquis, and known throughout London for her impeccable taste and sharp tongue. She did not sound eager or anxious as Lady Catherine had. Her voice was cool and measured as she described the 3 gowns she had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Paris, gowns of silk and lace and velvet in colors that would make every other woman in any ballroom fade into insignificance. She spoke of fashion as if it were a form of warfare, a strategic weapon in the battle for social supremacy. She said that a duchess must be the most elegant woman in any room, must set the standard by which all other women were judged, and that these gowns would accomplish exactly that. Again, the Duke said nothing. Again, that small nod, that wordless gesture to continue. The auburn-haired woman was Miss Evelyn Blackwood, daughter of a wealthy industrialist who had bought his way into society through sheer force of money and determination. She spoke with less polish than the other 2, but with more confidence, as if she knew exactly what men wanted and how to provide it. She described perfumes from the Orient, silk stockings from Italy, cosmetics and creams and preparations that would keep her beautiful for years to come. She spoke of beauty as currency, as the only real power a woman had in this world, and she said that she had invested her £5,000 in ensuring that power would never fade. When she finished, the room fell silent again. The 3 ladies looked at each other with expressions of satisfaction and superiority, secure in the knowledge that they had demonstrated exactly the qualities a duchess should possess: refinement, elegance, beauty, an understanding of social position and the importance of appearances. Then the Duke finally turned from the window, and his gray eyes moved across the 3 women with something that might have been disappointment or disgust or simply boredom. He looked at them as one might look at paintings that had been hung in the wrong rooms, technically accomplished but fundamentally inappropriate. And then his eyes found me, standing near the door in my plain black dress with my work-roughened hands folded in front of me, and something in his expression shifted in a way I could not quite read. He said my name. Just that, Margaret, in his low, rough voice, and it was both a question and a command. I swallowed hard and took one step forward. My mouth was dry and my heart was beating so fast I thought surely everyone must hear it. I had prepared what I would say, had practiced the words in my head during the long walk to the manor that morning, but now they all seemed foolish and inadequate. What could I say? That I had spent the money on food and medicine? That I had paid off debts and bought fabric for dresses? That I had done exactly what any sensible poor person would do when suddenly given more money than they had ever dreamed of possessing? I told him the truth. I told him about my mother's illness, about the medicine from London that was already helping her breathe more easily. I told him about Rose, about how she had never had enough to eat and never complained, but I could see the hunger in her young face. I told him about our debts, about how they had hung over us like chains, how I had lived in constant fear that we would lose even the small cottage that was all we had left of my father. I told him about the food I had bought, enough to last through the winter and beyond, about the rent paid in advance so that Rose could sleep without fear of being turned out into the cold. I did not tell him about the fabric for the dresses or the shawl or the ribbon. Those things seemed too small and too personal to mention, and I did not want him to think I had spent any of his money on vanity. As I spoke, I watched his face, trying to understand what he was thinking, what he was feeling, but his expression remained unreadable. The 3 ladies were staring at me now with a mixture of shock and contempt, as if I had just confessed to some terrible crime. Lady Catherine's mouth had fallen open slightly. Lady Victoria's eyes had narrowed to slits. Miss Blackwood was shaking her head slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her painted lips. When I finished speaking, The silence that followed felt heavy and suffocating. I could hear the clock on the mantelpiece ticking, each second marked out like a judgment. I could hear someone's sharp intake of breath, could feel the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on me like a physical thing. Then the Duke spoke, and his voice was different somehow, less cold, less distant. He asked me how much of the £5,000 I had spent. I told him nearly all of it, perhaps £4,000 on necessities, and the rest set aside for future needs. He asked if I had bought anything for myself, anything at all, and I hesitated before admitting to the fabric for a dress, though I said it was more for decency than for vanity, as my work clothes were wearing thin. He nodded slowly, and then he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He smiled. It was not a large smile, barely a softening of his stern mouth, but it changed his entire face, made him look younger and less forbidding, made me suddenly aware that he might once have been capable of warmth before grief and betrayal had frozen him from the inside out. He said that I had passed his test. He said that the others had failed. The room erupted. Lady Catherine stood up so quickly her chair fell backward, demanding to know what he meant. How spending money on jewels could possibly be wrong when that was exactly what any woman of quality would do. Lady Victoria's voice cut through the air like a blade, saying that this was an insult to her family and to every standard of decency and breeding. Miss Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and said that if the Duke wanted to marry a kitchen maid, then he was welcome to his choice, but he should not expect society to accept such a union. The Duke raised one hand, and the protests stopped, though the fury in their faces did not diminish. He said that his late wife had spent money the way they did, on beautiful things and expensive things and meaningless things, while the people who worked on his estates went hungry and the tenants fell behind on their rent and the village fell into poverty and despair. He said that he had been blind to it, had allowed her to drain his fortune on her vanities while real people suffered real consequences. He said that he would not make that mistake again, that any woman who would be his duchess must understand that wealth came with responsibility, that privilege demanded care for those who had less. He said that I was the only one who had demonstrated that understanding. The three ladies left in a storm of silk and fury, their faces red with humiliation and rage. Lady Catherine was crying, though whether from hurt or anger I could not tell. Lady Victoria paused at the door to tell the Duke that he would regret this decision, that no woman of quality would ever accept him now, that he had made himself a laughingstock. Miss Blackwood simply stared at me with naked hatred before sweeping out without another word. And then I was alone with the Duke, standing in his study with my heart racing and my mind reeling, trying to understand what had just happened. He had said I passed his test. Did that mean he intended to marry me? The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that I could barely process it. I was a maid. He was a duke. Such things did not happen outside of fairy tales, and even in fairy tales they usually ended badly. He turned back to the window, his moment of warmth vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He said that I should not misunderstand his meaning, that passing the test did not mean he had chosen me as his bride, only that I had demonstrated better judgment than the alternatives. He said that his grandmother would be pleased, that she had insisted all along that true character was more important than breeding or beauty, but that he personally remained unconvinced that marriage to anyone was a wise decision. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. I asked him why he had included me in the test if he had no intention of actually considering me. I asked him if this had all been some cruel game, a way to humiliate both me and the fine ladies who had thought themselves worthy of his attention. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to strain to hear it. He said that his grandmother was dying, that she had perhaps 2 months left at most, and that her final wish was to see him settled with a woman who would be a true partner rather than a decorative ornament. He said that she had been the one who insisted on including me, that she had watched me work for 5 years and had seen something in me that she believed was worth testing. He said that he had agreed only to give her peace in her final days, but that he had fully expected me to spend the money as frivolously as the others, to prove that all women were essentially the same, regardless of their station. He said that I had surprised him, and he did not sound pleased about it. I should have left then. I should have thanked him politely for the opportunity and returned to my work and forgotten that any of this had ever happened. But something in his voice, some note of pain beneath the coldness, made me bold in a way I had never been before. I asked him what his wife had done to make him hate all women so deeply. I asked him what betrayal had frozen his heart so completely that he could not see any warmth or goodness anywhere. He turned to face me then, and the look in his eyes was so full of anguish that I took an involuntary step backward. He said that his wife had taken lovers, multiple lovers, throughout their marriage. He said that she had spent his money to buy gifts for these men, had humiliated him in front of all of society, had laughed at his pain, and called him a fool for ever believing she could love someone as cold and boring as he was. He said that when she died, thrown from a horse during a midnight ride to meet her latest paramour, he had felt nothing but relief, and that the guilt of that relief had been eating away at him ever since. He said that he did not believe in love anymore. He said that he did not trust women, did not trust anyone, and that the only reason he was even considering remarriage was to satisfy his grandmother's dying wish and to secure an heir for the estate. He said that any marriage he entered into would be one of convenience only, a business arrangement with clear expectations and no illusions about affection or fidelity. I stood there absorbing this flood of bitter confession, understanding that he was telling me these things, not because he wanted my sympathy, but because he wanted to drive me away, to make sure I understood exactly how impossible and miserable any future with him would be. He wanted me to reject him before he could reject me, to spare himself the pain of hoping for something better and being disappointed once again. But I did not feel repelled. I felt desperately sad for him, for the lonely man standing in front of me who had been hurt so badly that he could no longer imagine being whole. I thought about my own losses, my own griefs, the way my father's death had shattered our family and the way my mother's illness had slowly been killing us all. I thought about how easy it would be to become bitter, to close off my heart and decide that caring for people only led to pain and disappointment. But I had not done that. I had kept loving, kept caring, kept sacrificing everything for my mother and my sister because that was what love meant, even when it hurt, even when it was hard. And I wondered if perhaps the Duke needed someone to show him that love did not have to be a weapon, that it could also be a shelter. I told him that I was sorry for his pain. I told him that his wife had been wrong to treat him that way, that no one deserved such cruelty regardless of their faults or failings. I told him that not all women were like her, that not all relationships ended in betrayal, and that he deserved a chance at happiness even if he no longer believed in it. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He reached out and touched my face, just the lightest brush of his fingers against my cheek, so gentle and so brief that I might have imagined it. His hand was warm and slightly rough, and the touch sent something electric through my entire body, some feeling I had no name for and no experience with. He said my name again, Margaret, but this time it sounded different, less like a command and more like a question, like he was trying to understand something that made no sense to him. He said that I should go now, that he needed time to think, that his grandmother would want to see me, and that I should visit her this afternoon. He said that we would speak again soon, but he did not say what about, did not make any promises or declarations. I left the study in a daze, my cheek still tingling where he had touched it, my heart full of confused emotions that I did not dare examine too closely. The other servants stared at me as I walked through the corridors, and I knew that word of what had happened in the Duke's study was already spreading through the household like wildfire. Mrs. Hartley stopped me in the hallway and asked sharply what I thought I was doing, whether I had lost my mind, whether I understood that servants who reached above their station always fell harder than they could imagine. I told her that I had done nothing wrong, that I had only answered the Duke's questions honestly, and that whatever happened next was not in my control. She looked at me with something like pity mixed with contempt, and told me that I would learn soon enough that honesty was a luxury poor people could not afford. That afternoon, I went to visit the Dowager Duchess in her suite of rooms on the second floor. I had been there only a handful of times before, always to deliver messages or trays, never invited to stay. The rooms were beautiful and old-fashioned, full of furniture and decorations from a different era, and they smelled of lavender and age and impending death. The Dowager Duchess was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows, looking impossibly small and fragile in her white nightgown. But her eyes were bright and sharp when they fixed on me, and her voice was strong when she told me to come closer and sit down. She asked me what I had bought with the £5,000. I told her, and she nodded as if this confirmed something she had already known. She said that she had been watching me since the day I arrived at Ashford Manor, that she had seen how I worked, and how I carried myself, and how I never complained even when things were difficult. She said that she had seen the same quality in herself when she was young, the same understanding that real strength came from sacrifice and service, rather than from beauty or breeding. She told me that her grandson was a good man who had been badly hurt, that his wife's betrayal had damaged something essential in him that might never fully heal. She said that he needed someone who understood pain and loss, someone who would not give up on him even when he pushed her away, someone who could teach him how to hope again. She said that she believed I was that person. I told her, as gently as I could, that the Duke had no interest in marrying me, that he saw me only as proof of a point, that he had made it very clear that any marriage he entered into would be one of cold convenience rather than warm affection. I told her that I was grateful for her faith in me, but that I did not think love could grow where there was only bitterness and distrust. She smiled at me, a smile full of secrets and understanding. She said that her own marriage had begun in just such bitterness, that her husband had married her only to spite his family, who wanted him to choose someone of better birth, and that she had agreed only because she needed security and protection. She said that they had spent the first year of their marriage barely speaking to each other, circling each other like wary animals, each waiting for the other to prove themselves unworthy. And then, slowly, something had changed. Small acts of kindness, moments of unexpected understanding, the gradual realization that the person they had married might actually see them, truly see them, in ways that no one else ever had. She said that by the time her husband died 30 years later, she had loved him more than she had ever thought possible, and that his loss had nearly destroyed her. She told me that real love was not the breathless infatuation of ballrooms and poetry. It was the slow, painful, difficult work of learning to trust another person with your broken pieces and hoping they would not cut themselves on the sharp edges. She said that if I was brave enough to attempt it, she believed her grandson and I might find something rare and precious in each other. But she said that I would have to be patient, that I would have to endure his coldness and his cruelty and his attempts to drive me away, and that there would be many times when I would wonder if it was worth the effort. She asked me if I was brave enough for that. She asked me if I was willing to fight for something I did not yet have, to believe in something I could not yet see. I sat there in her lavender-scented room with death hovering in the corners and thought about my mother and Rose and all the impossible things I had already done to keep them safe and alive. I thought about the Duke's gray eyes and the way his hand had felt against my cheek and the loneliness that radiated from him like cold from winter ground. And I realized that I was already halfway in love with him, that something in me had recognized something in him. Some shared understanding of pain and perseverance and the desperate need to believe that life could still hold beauty despite everything that tried to crush it out of us. I told the Dowager Duchess that I would try. I told her that I did not know if I was brave enough or strong enough or wise enough, but that I would do my best because she had asked it of me, and because something in me could not bear to walk away from the possibility of something more. She reached out and took my hand in her thin, papery fingers, and she told me that was all she needed to hear. She said that she would make the arrangements, that within a fortnight the Duke and I would be married, and that whatever happened after that would be up to us. I left her rooms feeling as if I were walking in a dream, as if everything that was happening were too strange and too impossible to be real. I was going to marry the Duke of Ashford. I was going to become a duchess, a title I could barely even pronounce properly, a position so far above my station that it felt like a joke. And I was going to try to heal the heart of a man who believed his heart was beyond saving. I walked back to my cottage that evening through the gathering dusk, and when I told my mother and Rose what had happened, they both stared at me as if I had lost my mind. My mother, despite her illness, sat up in bed and demanded to know if I understood what I was agreeing to, whether I had any idea how dangerous it was to marry a man who did not love me, who might never love me, who had been so badly hurt that he had turned into someone cold and cruel. I told her that I understood better than anyone, because I had spent my whole life loving people who needed me more than they loved me back, and somehow I had survived it. I told her that I was choosing this, that no one was forcing me, and that for once in my life I wanted to try for something more than just survival. I wanted to reach for happiness, even if I fell, even if I failed. Rose hugged me tightly and whispered that she was frightened for me. And I was frightened too, more frightened than I had ever been, because I knew that I was walking into something that could break me in ways that poverty and grief never had. But I was also, for the first time in years, full of hope. And that felt dangerous and reckless and absolutely necessary. The fortnight before my wedding passed in a blur of activity that felt both frantic and dreamlike, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold while I stood trapped behind glass. The Dowager Duchess, despite her failing health, managed the arrangements with an efficiency that left no room for doubt or hesitation. She summoned dressmakers and solicitors, sent announcements to the newspapers, and made it clear to everyone in the household that I was to be treated with the respect due to the future Duchess of Ashford, regardless of my origins. The servants obeyed her, but their obedience was cold and resentful. They called me Miss Thornton now instead of Margaret, but the title sat awkwardly in their mouths like something bitter they were forced to swallow. Mrs. Hartley barely spoke to me, except to deliver curt instructions about which rooms I would occupy after the wedding, her face tight with disapproval every time she looked at me. The other maids whispered behind their hands when I passed, and more than once I overheard them speculating about how long it would take before the Duke tired of his common bride and sent me back to where I belonged. I moved through those days in a state of constant anxiety, trying to learn everything I needed to know about being a duchess while still visiting my mother and Rose every evening to reassure them that I had not forgotten who I was or where I came from. My mother's health continued to improve with the good medicine, and the relief in her eyes when she looked at me was almost worth the fear that gripped my chest every time I thought about what I had agreed to do. The Duke himself was conspicuously absent during the preparations. I saw him only twice in that fortnight, both times from a distance, and he did not acknowledge me either time. The Dowager Duchess told me not to take it personally, that he was struggling with the reality of what was about to happen, that he had not expected to marry again so soon after his wife's death, and certainly had not expected to marry someone like me. She said it with sympathy, but also with a warning, as if reminding me that I had chosen this path and must now walk it regardless of how rocky the ground became. The wedding was to be a small affair, held in the private chapel on the estate, with only immediate family and a handful of witnesses present. The Dowager Duchess had insisted on this, saying that a large society wedding would be inappropriate so soon after the late Duchess's death, and would also subject me to scrutiny and judgment that I was not yet prepared to handle. I was grateful for this mercy, though I knew it also meant that society would view the marriage as slightly scandalous, something done in haste and secrecy because it could not bear the light of day. My wedding dress was beautiful, far more beautiful than anything I had ever worn or even imagined wearing. It was cream-colored silk, with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves, elegant but not ostentatious, suitable for a widow's wedding rather than a first bride's celebration. When I looked at myself in the mirror on the morning of the wedding, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My hair had been styled by the Dowager Duchess's own lady's maid, swept up in a way that made my neck look longer and my face less round. My hands, usually red and rough from work, had been soaked and creamed until they looked almost gentle. But my eyes were the same, brown and worried and full of questions I did not know how to ask. Rose helped me dress, her own eyes bright with tears that she tried to hide. She told me I looked like a princess from a storybook, but there was fear beneath her smile, fear that I was leaving her behind, fear that I would change into someone she did not recognize, fear that this fairy tale would turn dark before the last page. I held her tightly and promised that I would always be her sister, that becoming a duchess would not make me forget the cottage where we had shared a bed and the hunger we had survived together. My mother could not attend the wedding. She was still too weak to travel, and the walk to the manor would have been impossible for her. But she held my hands before I left and told me that she was proud of me, that my father would have been proud, and that I should remember that true nobility came from the heart rather than from titles or bloodlines. She told me to be brave and to be kind and to never let anyone make me feel small or unworthy. I walked to the chapel alone, as I had no father to give me away and no family at the manor except the Dowager Duchess who was already inside. The path through the gardens was lined with late spring flowers, and the air smelled of roses and rain and possibility. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst through the silk of my dress, and my hands were trembling despite the cream that had been rubbed into them. The chapel was old and beautiful, with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the stone floor and wooden pews that had been polished by generations of worshippers. There were perhaps 20 people present, most of them servants who had been given permission to attend, along with the Dowager Duchess in her wheelchair near the front and the Duke's solicitor and the minister who would perform the ceremony. And there, standing at the altar, was the Duke himself, dressed in black except for a white shirt and cravat, looking every inch the aristocrat he was born to be. He did not turn when I entered. He kept his eyes fixed on the cross above the altar, as if he could not bear to look at me, as if acknowledging my presence would make this marriage more real than he could endure. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, though inside I was screaming with fear and doubt. What was I doing? What had I agreed to? How could I possibly think that I could be the wife of this cold, distant man who looked at me as if I were a duty to be endured rather than a partner to be cherished? But then I reached the altar and stood beside him, and he finally turned to look at me, and for just a moment something flickered in his gray eyes. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps recognition, perhaps acknowledgement that I was there, that I was real, that this was actually happening. And then his expression closed again, like a door slamming shut, and he turned back to face the minister. The ceremony was brief and formal, the words ancient and binding. I spoke my vows in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt, promising to honor and obey and remain faithful through all the days of my life. The Duke spoke his vows in a monotone, as if reading from a legal document, promising to protect and provide, but noticeably leaving out the word love. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, there was no kiss, no tender moment, just a curt nod from the Duke before he turned and walked back down the aisle without waiting for me. I followed him out of the chapel into the pale morning sunlight, now Margaret Thornton no longer but Margaret, Duchess of Ashford, a title that felt like a costume I was wearing rather than something that truly belonged to me. The small gathering of witnesses applauded politely, but there was no joy in the sound, No celebration, only the fulfillment of an obligation. A wedding breakfast had been prepared in the formal dining room, but the Duke did not attend. He sent word through his secretary that he had urgent estate business to attend to and would see me that evening. The Dowager Duchess looked disappointed, but not surprised, and she presided over the breakfast with as much grace as her failing health would allow, making conversation and ensuring that no one commented on the groom's absence. I sat at the head of the table in the chair that had belonged to the late Duchess, picking at food I could not taste, surrounded by servants who would not meet my eyes and a few distant relations who looked at me with barely concealed curiosity and contempt. I was a duchess now, but I had never felt more like an imposter, more aware of every gap in my education and breeding and understanding of how this world worked. After the breakfast, the Dowager Duchess summoned me to her rooms. She looked exhausted, the morning's activities having drained what little energy she had left, but her eyes were still sharp when she looked at me. She told me that I had done well, that I had held myself with dignity despite the difficult circumstances. Then she told me things I needed to know about being a duchess, about managing the household and dealing with the servants and presenting myself in society when the time came for that particular ordeal. She also told me, with a directness that made me flinch, what to expect on my wedding night. She said that my husband would come to my rooms after dark, that he would likely be cold and perfunctory, that I should not expect tenderness or passion, but should focus on fulfilling my duty and providing him with an heir. She said that many marriages of our class were conducted this way, that love was not required for conception, and that I should not take his coldness personally. I listened to her advice with burning cheeks and a growing sense of dread, understanding that I had agreed not just to a marriage, but to a kind of intimate violation that would be sanctioned by law and custom. The thought of the Duke touching me with the same cold efficiency he had shown during our wedding ceremony made something inside me curl up and die a little. But the Dowager Duchess saw my expression and reached out to take my hand. She told me that men who had been badly hurt often retreated into coldness as a form of protection, but that underneath that ice there was still a human heart capable of warmth if only someone could find a way to reach it. She told me to be patient, to be gentle, to remember that every act of physical intimacy was also an opportunity for emotional connection, even if that connection was one-sided at first. She told me that she believed in me, that she had faith I could reach her grandson in ways no one else had been able to, but that it would take time and courage and a willingness to be hurt repeatedly before any progress could be made. She asked me again if I was brave enough for this, and I told her that I had no choice now but to be brave, that I had made my vows and would honor them regardless of how difficult the path ahead might be. I spent the rest of that afternoon exploring the suite of rooms that were now mine, the Duchess's apartments on the second floor of the manor. They were beautiful and spacious, decorated in pale blues and silvers, with a sitting room and a bedroom and a dressing room and a private bathroom with actual running water heated by pipes from the basement. It was luxury beyond anything I had ever experienced, and I should have felt grateful and awed, but instead I felt like I was living in a museum, surrounded by beautiful things that did not belong to me and never would. The late Duchess's belongings had been cleared away, but her presence still lingered in the rooms like a ghost. I could imagine her standing at the window, looking out over the gardens, could picture her sitting at the dressing table, arranging her hair, could sense her everywhere I looked. And I wondered what she had felt in these rooms, whether she had been happy or lonely or angry, whether she had loved her husband before she betrayed him, or whether their marriage had always been cold. Evening came slowly, the light fading from the windows until the rooms were full of shadows that the lamps could not quite banish. A maid came to help me prepare for bed, a young girl I did not know who looked terrified to be serving the new Duchess. She helped me out of my wedding dress and into a nightgown that had been provided by the Dowager Duchess, white silk that felt like water against my skin and made me feel more exposed than my work clothes ever had. Then I was alone, sitting on the edge of the large bed that dominated the bedroom, waiting for my husband to come claim what was now his by-law and custom. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2 hours, and with each passing moment my anxiety grew until I was nearly sick with it. I did not know which would be worse, having him come and fulfill the duty coldly and quickly, or having him not come at all and leave me here wondering if he found me so repulsive that he could not even bring himself to touch me. It was nearly midnight when I finally heard footsteps in the corridor outside my rooms. The door opened without a knock, and the Duke entered, still dressed in his black wedding clothes, though he had removed his cravat and his shirt was partially unbuttoned. He looked tired and perhaps a little drunk, his eyes unfocused and his movements less controlled than usual. He stood just inside the door staring at me, and I stood up from the bed, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for him to speak or move or do something to break the terrible silence that stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and angry, though I could not tell if the anger was directed at me or at himself or at the entire situation we found ourselves in. He said that he had not wanted this, that he had never wanted to marry again, that his grandmother had manipulated him into this marriage by exploiting his guilt and his sense of duty. He said that I should not expect anything from him beyond the basic courtesies required by law, that we would live separate lives under the same roof, and that he would come to my bed only as often as necessary to produce an heir and secure the succession. He said these things standing 10 feet away from me, his hands clenched at his sides, his whole body radiating tension and resentment. And something inside me, some last fragile hope that I had been nursing despite everything, finally cracked and broke. I had known this would be difficult. I had known he was damaged and cold. But hearing him say so baldly that he had no intention of ever trying to care for me, that I was nothing more than a duty to be endured, made me feel more alone than I had ever felt even in my poorest, hungriest days. I could have accepted his terms meekly. I could have nodded and agreed and made myself small and invisible the way I had learned to do as a servant. But something in me rebelled against that. Some stubbornness that my mother had passed down to me along with her brown eyes and her practical hands. I told him that I had not wanted this either, that I had agreed to marry him only because his grandmother had asked it of me and because I had believed that even he deserved a chance at happiness despite his determination to be miserable. I told him that I understood he had been hurt, that his wife had betrayed him in terrible ways, but that I was not her, and I would not be punished for her sins. I told him that he could keep his distance and his coldness if that was what he needed, but that I would not live my life apologizing for existing or feeling grateful for scraps of basic human decency. I told him that I had married him in good faith, that I had made vows before God to honor and care for him, and that I intended to keep those vows even if he had no intention of keeping his. He stared at me with something that might have been surprise or anger, or perhaps even grudging respect. No one spoke to him that way, I realized. No one challenged him or pushed back or demanded anything from him. They either fawned over him because of his title or avoided him because of his reputation. But no one treated him like a real person capable of better behavior. He took 3 steps toward me, and I forced myself not to back away, even though every instinct screamed at me to maintain distance. He stopped close enough that I could smell whiskey on his breath and see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He said that I was either very brave or very foolish, and he had not yet decided which. He said that my defiance would not last, that eventually I would learn to regret my boldness, that marriage to him was not an adventure, but a slow form of death for any woman foolish enough to care. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me standing alone in my white silk nightgown in the middle of my beautiful bedroom, shaking with emotions I could not name. He did not come back that night. He did not fulfill his duty or claim his rights or do any of the things the Dowager Duchess had warned me to expect. He simply left me there, and I did not know if I felt relieved or rejected, or both at once. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me, wondering what I had done, and whether there was any possible way this marriage could end in anything but heartbreak. But mixed with the fear and doubt was also a strange kind of determination. I had stood up to him. I had refused to be diminished. And something in his eyes before he left had told me that he had noticed, that perhaps somewhere beneath all that ice there was still a man capable of seeing me as more than just an unwanted obligation. The next morning, I woke early from habit and had to remind myself that I was no longer expected to lay fires or prepare breakfast or scrub floors. A maid brought me tea and helped me dress in one of the new day gowns that had been made for me. A simple blue dress that was more elegant than anything I had ever owned, but still relatively plain by Duchess standards. I asked the maid where the Duke was, and she told me with barely concealed satisfaction that he had left before dawn to ride the estate boundaries and was not expected back until evening. I spent that first day as a duchess trying to learn my new responsibilities. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Reynolds who had replaced Mrs. Hartley as the senior servant now that I was no longer staff, walked me through the house explaining what was expected of me in terms of household management. I was to oversee the menus, manage the servants, handle correspondence, receive visitors, and maintain the standards that befitted the Duchess's position. It was overwhelming, like trying to learn a new language while everyone watched and waited for me to make mistakes. The servants treated me with formal respect that felt more like mockery. They curtsied when I passed and called me Your Grace with perfect pronunciation, but their eyes were cold and judgmental. I heard the whispers behind closed doors, the speculation about how long the Duke would tolerate his common bride, the bets on when he would send me away or take a mistress or simply ignore me into irrelevance. I visited the Dowager Duchess every afternoon, and she helped me navigate the impossible maze of aristocratic expectations and social rules that I had never needed to know as a servant. She taught me how to hold myself, how to speak, how to manage the subtle power dynamics that governed every interaction in this world. She was patient with my mistakes, but firm in her corrections, and I could see that even these short lessons exhausted her terribly. She asked me once, about a week after the wedding, if the Duke had visited my rooms yet. When I told her he had not, that he avoided me as much as possible and spoke to me only when absolutely necessary, she looked disappointed, but not surprised. She said that she had hoped he would at least make an effort, but that old wounds ran deep and healing took time. She said I should not give up, that I should continue to be present and available and patient, and that eventually his loneliness would overcome his fear. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to doubt whether patience would be enough. The Duke treated me like a stranger who happened to live in his house. We took meals together when social propriety demanded it, sitting at opposite ends of the long dining table and making stilted conversation about nothing of consequence. He never asked about my day or my thoughts or my feelings. He never touched me, not even accidentally. He moved through the manor like a ghost, and I moved through it like a shadow, and we existed in the same space without ever truly connecting. The only bright spot in those lonely weeks was my continued visits to my mother and Rose. I went every few days, usually in the afternoon when the Duke was out managing the estate, and those hours in our small cottage felt more real than anything in the manor. My mother continued to improve, gaining strength and color, able to sit up and even walk around the rooms now. Rose was learning to read and write from books I had brought from the manor's library, and her joy in this new skill made my heart ache with love for her. They asked me if I was happy, and I lied and said yes. I told them about the beautiful rooms and the fine food and the luxury of having servants wait on me instead of being the one who served. I did not tell them about the crushing loneliness, about how I lay awake every night in my large bed, wondering if my husband would ever see me as anything more than an unwanted burden. I did not tell them that I was beginning to wonder if the Dowager Duchess had been wrong, if some hearts were too broken to ever heal, if some people were too damaged to ever let anyone close. Then, 6 weeks after our wedding, everything changed. I was in the library one afternoon, trying to distract myself with a book I could barely comprehend, when I heard raised voices from the Duke's study down the hall. One voice belonged to the Duke himself, angry and defensive. The other belonged to a woman, and there was something familiar about it, even though I could not immediately place it. I should have stayed in the library. I should have minded my own business and respected my husband's privacy. But something about the urgency in those voices drew me out into the corridor, and I found myself standing outside the study door, listening to a conversation I was not meant to hear. The woman was Lady Victoria Ashworth, one of the 3 ladies who had failed the Duke's test. Her voice was sharp and accusing as she demanded to know what the Duke had discovered about his late wife's death, whether he had finally accepted that it had not been an accident, as everyone had been told. She said that she had information, that she knew things about that night that would shock him, that if he wanted the truth, he needed to listen to her. The Duke's voice was cold and cutting as he told her to leave, that he had no interest in her gossip or her schemes, that whatever she thought she knew about his late wife was irrelevant now. But Lady Victoria laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and said that he could not hide from the truth forever, that everyone in society knew his wife had been planning to leave him, that she had been in love with someone else and had been preparing to create the scandal of the decade. She said that the night his wife died, she had not been riding to meet a lover, as everyone believed. She had been riding away from the manor carrying letters and jewels, planning to disappear and never come back. She said that the Duke's wife had not died in an accident, but had been thrown from her horse when someone had deliberately frightened the animal, and that there were witnesses who had seen a figure near the stables that night, someone who might have had reasons to want the Duchess dead. The silence that followed these words was so heavy I could barely breathe. Then the Duke's voice came again, low and dangerous, asking Lady Victoria what she wanted, why she had come here with these accusations, what price she expected him to pay for her silence. And she told him the truth with a boldness that made my blood run cold. She said that she wanted him to annul his marriage to me, to admit that he had made a mistake marrying beneath his station, and to choose her instead as his Duchess. She said that if he did not comply, she would take her information to the authorities, would create a scandal that would destroy what little remained of his reputation. I did not wait to hear his response. I turned and walked quickly back to my rooms, my heart pounding and my mind racing with the implications of what I had just heard. The late Duchess had not simply been unfaithful. She had been planning to abandon her husband entirely, to create a scandal that would have ruined him socially and financially. And someone had stopped her, permanently, in a way that might have been murder rather than accident. Did the Duke know? Had he suspected? Was he protecting someone? Or was he simply too grief-stricken and guilty to face the truth about what had really happened that night? And what did Lady Victoria truly know, and how could she prove any of it? I sat in my sitting room as evening fell, unable to read or sew or do any of the gentle activities that were supposed to occupy a duchess's time, waiting for the Duke to come find me, to tell me what had happened in his study, to ask for my help or my counsel or simply my presence. But he did not come. Hours passed, and the manor grew quiet around me, and still there was no sign of him. Finally, well after dark, I could bear the waiting no longer. I left my rooms and went searching for him, moving through the shadowy corridors like a ghost, checking the study and the library and the drawing rooms, finding them all empty. A servant told me that the Duke had gone out hours ago and had not yet returned, that his horse was missing from the stable and that no one knew where he had gone. I went back to my rooms and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. I kept thinking about Lady Victoria's accusations, about the late Duchess's planned flight, about the figure near the stables on the night she died. I kept thinking about my husband, riding alone through the darkness, carrying secrets and grief that were slowly destroying him from the inside out. When dawn finally came and he still had not returned, I made a decision. I would not sit passively in my beautiful rooms waiting for him to shut me out. I would not accept the cold distance he insisted on maintaining. I would find him, and I would make him talk to me, make him see that he did not have to carry these burdens alone, that I had married him for better or worse, and that meant being present in the worst moments, as well as whatever better ones might eventually come. I dressed quickly in my riding habit, another new garment I barely knew how to wear properly, and I went down to the stables. The groom looked surprised to see me, and even more surprised when I told him to saddle a horse for me. He tried to protest, saying that the Duchess should not ride without an escort, but I told him firmly that I knew how to ride and that I would go with or without his help. The truth was, I had not ridden a horse in years, not since I was a girl, and my father had occasionally borrowed a farmer's old mare for me to practice on, but I remembered enough to manage, and the horse the groom gave me was gentle and patient with my rustiness. I rode out across the estate as the sun rose over the hills, not knowing where I was going, but trusting that something would guide me to where I needed to be. I found him, an hour later, sitting on his horse at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley, staring out at the morning mist with an expression so full of anguish that it stopped my breath in my chest. He did not turn when I approached, though he must have heard my horse's hooves on the rocky ground. He simply sat there, still as stone, and I wondered if he was thinking about his late wife, about the night she died, about whether he could have saved her or whether he even wanted to. I stopped my horse beside his and said his name softly, Christian. I had never called him by his given name before, had always used his title as distance and respect required. But in that moment, on that cliff with the morning light breaking through the clouds, I needed him to hear me as a person rather than as a duchess speaking to a duke. He finally turned to look at me, and his face was ravaged with something beyond simple grief, something darker and more complicated that I did not fully understand. And he asked me a question I had not expected, asked me in a voice so broken it barely sounded like him at all. He asked me if I believed people could be forgiven for terrible things, for choices made in anger or pain or desperation that could never be undone. He asked me if some sins were too great to ever be absolved, if some guilt was too heavy to ever be laid down. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that he was not talking about his late wife's betrayal. He was talking about himself. I dismounted from my horse and stood beside him on that cliff edge, the wind pulling at my hair and my skirts, the morning sun burning away the mist in the valley below. The distance between us felt both impossibly vast and terrifyingly narrow, as if one wrong word could send him over that edge, as if one right word might pull him back from whatever precipice he was standing on inside himself. I told him that I believed in forgiveness, that I believed people could carry terrible burdens and still be worthy of redemption. I told him that whatever he had done, whatever choices he had made, he did not have to carry them alone anymore. I told him that I had made vows to stand beside him, and that I meant them even if he did not believe I could possibly understand what I was promising. He laughed then, a sound without any humor in it, raw and bitter as winter wind. He said that I did not know what I was offering, that I was too good and too innocent to comprehend the darkness that lived inside him. He said that his wife had not died in an accident, that she had not been thrown from a frightened horse by chance. He said that he had been there that night, that he had followed her when she left the manor with her bags packed and her lover's letters clutched in her hands, and that what happened next had changed him into someone he barely recognized. I stood very still, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for him to continue. Part of me wanted to stop him, to tell him I did not need to know, that some truths were too heavy to be spoken aloud. But a larger part understood that he needed to tell someone, that he had been carrying this secret for 6 months, and it was slowly poisoning him from the inside out. And if he could not tell his wife, who could he tell? He said that he had caught up to her on the road, that he had called out to her, that his voice had been full of rage and pain and betrayal. He said that she had turned on her horse to face him, her beautiful face twisted with contempt, and she had told him that she had never loved him, that their entire marriage had been a lie, that she was leaving him for a man who actually knew how to make a woman feel alive. She had laughed at his pain, mocked his shock, told him that everyone in society had known about her affairs and had pitied him for being such a fool. He said that something inside him had broken in that moment, that years of humiliation and hurt and swallowed pride had finally erupted. He said that he had shouted at her, called her terrible names, told her that she would never see another penny of his money, that he would ruin her and her lover both if she dared to leave him. He said that his rage had been like a living thing, consuming and terrible, and that his voice had been loud enough to frighten both horses. His wife's horse had reared, spooked by his shouting and by the storm that was rolling in across the hills. He said he had watched as she struggled to control the animal, as it bucked and twisted as she lost her grip on the reins. He said he could have helped her, could have ridden closer and grabbed the bridle, could have done something to prevent what was about to happen. But he had not. He had sat frozen on his horse, paralyzed by rage and hurt, and a terrible dark desire to see her suffer the way she had made him suffer. The horse had thrown her. She had fallen badly, her head striking a rock at the side of the road. And he had sat there for long minutes, watching her lie still and broken, wondering if she was dead or merely unconscious, feeling something cold and empty where his heart should have been. By the time he had finally dismounted and gone to her, by the time he had lifted her and felt how limp and lifeless she was in his arms, it was far too late. She was gone, and whether he had killed her through action or inaction felt like a distinction without meaning. He said that he had carried her body back to the manor and told everyone it had been an accident, that she had been out riding alone when her horse had been frightened by the storm. No one had questioned his story. No one had suspected that he might have been there, might have contributed to her death through his rage and his paralysis and his momentary desire for revenge. They had all simply pitied the grieving widower and left him alone with his guilt. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed felt alive with unsaid things, with judgment and fear and the potential for everything to shatter irreparably. He finally turned to look at me, his gray eyes full of something that might have been hope or might have been desperation, waiting for me to recoil from him, to be horrified by what he had revealed, to prove that he was right to keep everyone at a distance. But I did not recoil. I did not turn away. Instead, I stepped closer to him and I took his hand, that rough, warm hand that had once touched my cheek so gently on the day we met, and I held it tightly in both of mine. I told him that what had happened was terrible, that his wife's death was a tragedy, regardless of how cruel she had been. But I told him that guilt and murder were not the same thing, that failing to act in a moment of shock and pain was not the same as deliberately causing harm. I told him that he had been hurt beyond bearing, that anyone would have struggled to respond rationally in that moment, that his paralysis was a human failing rather than a monstrous one. I told him that carrying this guilt was punishment enough, that he had been living in a prison of his own making for 6 months, and that perhaps it was time to consider the possibility of forgiving himself, even if he could never forget what happened. He pulled his hand away from mine, as if my touch burned him. He said that I did not understand, that I was too sheltered and too kind to grasp what he truly was. He said that he had wanted her to fall in that moment, that for a brief, terrible instant he had hoped the horse would throw her, that he had felt something dark and vengeful rise up in him that he had not known he was capable of feeling. He said that made him complicit in her death, that his thoughts and desires had contributed to what happened even if his hands had not. I told him that having dark thoughts did not make someone evil, that everyone had moments of anger and hurt where they wished ill on the people who had wounded them. I told him that the difference between good people and bad people was not in the absence of such thoughts, but in whether they acted on them, in whether they let those dark impulses define who they were. I told him that he had not pushed her off that horse, had not struck the animal to make it rear, had not done anything to directly cause her fall. His only crime was being too shocked and too hurt to react quickly enough. And that was not murder, no matter how much guilt he wanted to heap upon himself. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time since our wedding day. He said that I was either the most compassionate person he had ever met or the most foolish. He said that Lady Victoria knew something about that night, that she had witnesses who might have seen him on the road, that she was threatening to create a scandal that would destroy both of us unless he annulled our marriage and chose her instead. He said that he should probably do it, should set me free from this mess before I became irreparably tainted by association with him. I told him absolutely not. I told him that I had not married him to abandon him the moment things became difficult. I told him that Lady Victoria was trying to manipulate him with half-truths and implications, that whatever she thought she knew could not possibly be the whole story, and that we needed to face this together rather than letting her threats drive us apart. I told him that if he tried to annul our marriage to protect me, I would fight it, that I would stand by him publicly and privately, regardless of what scandal might come. Something in his face softened then, just slightly, just enough for me to see the man beneath the ice. He asked me why I was doing this, why I would risk my reputation and my future for a man who had given me nothing but coldness and distance. He asked me what I possibly hoped to gain from standing beside someone as damaged and broken as he was. I told him the truth. I told him that I loved him, that I had been falling in love with him since the day in his study when he had chosen my simple acts of care over the extravagance and vanity of women who only wanted his title and fortune. I told him that I had seen the pain in him and had recognized it because I carried my own pain, my own losses, my own understanding of how hard it was to keep going when life had broken you in ways that did not show on the outside. I told him that I was not asking him to love me back, that I understood he might never be capable of that kind of vulnerability again. But I told him that he deserved to have someone in his corner, someone who saw all of him, including the darkness, and did not turn away, someone who believed he was still worthy of happiness and redemption, even if he could not believe it himself. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the smell of rain from the distant hills. He dismounted from his horse and stood beside me on the cliff edge, so close I could feel the warmth of his body despite the cool morning air. For a long moment, he simply looked at me, his gray eyes searching my face as if trying to find the lie or the weakness or the breaking point. Then he reached out and touched my face again, the same gentle brush of fingers against my cheek that he had given me on our wedding day. Only this time his hand lingered, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with something that felt almost like wonder. He said my name, Margaret, in a voice that sounded different from any way he had said it before. He said that he did not deserve me, that he was not capable of giving me the kind of marriage I deserved, but that he was grateful, beyond words, that I was here, that I had not run from him when I learned the truth about what he was. He said that he did not know how to love anyone anymore, that his wife had burned that capacity out of him, but that if he were capable of it, he would choose to love me. I told him that was enough. I told him that we could build something real from that foundation, even if it took years, even if it was never the passionate romance of storybooks and poetry. I told him that I would rather have his honest broken pieces than someone else's pretty lies. Then he did something that shocked me more than anything else that had happened that morning. He pulled me into his arms and held me, just held me, his face buried in my hair and his body trembling slightly as if he were releasing something he had been holding too tightly for too long. I wrapped my arms around him and held him back, feeling the solid warmth of him, the rapid beating of his heart against my chest, the way he seemed to be breathing me in as if I were air and he had been drowning. We stood like that for a long time, two broken people clinging to each other on a cliff edge, the morning sun warming our backs and the wind pulling at our clothes, and something that had been knotted tight inside my chest for weeks finally began to loosen. This was not the romantic beginning I had dreamed of as a girl. This was not a fairy tale, but it was real and it was honest and it was ours. When we finally pulled apart, his eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen. He said that we needed to deal with Lady Victoria, that we could not let her threats hang over us like a sword waiting to fall. He said that he would go to her and tell her the truth, that he would explain what had really happened that night and let her do with the information whatever she chose. He said that he was tired of living in fear, tired of letting guilt and shame dictate his choices, and that perhaps it was time to face whatever consequences came from telling the truth. I told him that we would face those consequences together, that he did not have to do this alone. We rode back to the manor side by side, and for the first time since our wedding, the silence between us felt companionable rather than hostile. We did not speak much, but occasionally our eyes would meet and something would pass between us that felt like understanding, like the beginning of trust, like the first fragile shoots of something that might eventually grow into love if we tended it carefully enough. When we reached the manor, we found Lady Victoria's carriage still in the drive. She had remained at the manor overnight, having been offered hospitality despite the nature of her visit, and she was taking breakfast in the morning room when we entered. She looked up at our arrival with an expression of triumph that faded when she saw our joined hands, the way we stood together rather than apart. The Duke told her calmly and clearly exactly what had happened the night his wife died. He told her about the argument, about his rage, about his paralysis as he watched her fall. He told her that he had spent 6 months drowning in guilt for not acting quickly enough, but that he was done letting that guilt control him. He said that if she wanted to go to the authorities with her accusations, she was welcome to do so, but that he would not be blackmailed and he would not annul his marriage to appease her wounded pride. Lady Victoria listened with growing anger, her face flushing red as she realized she was losing control of the situation. She said that society would never accept what he had done, that even if he was not legally guilty of murder, the scandal would destroy him socially and financially. She said that he would be shunned, that his business associates would abandon him, that he would become a pariah among his own class. The Duke smiled then, a real smile that made him look years younger. He said that he had lived the past 6 months as a kind of pariah anyway, isolated by his own guilt and grief, and that he had learned that social acceptance mattered far less than he had once believed. He said that if he lost everything because of this scandal, at least he would lose it honestly rather than living under the shadow of blackmail and fear. He said that he had a wife now who understood him, who accepted him despite his failings, and that her good opinion mattered more to him than all of society's judgment combined. Lady Victoria looked at me with undisguised hatred. She said that I had ruined everything, that if I had not interfered, the Duke would have been desperate enough to accept her terms. She said that I was a common opportunist who had trapped a grieving man at his weakest moment, and that I would regret attaching myself to a man whose reputation was about to be destroyed. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her that she was wrong. I told her that I had not trapped anyone, that I had been honest about who I was and what I could offer from the very beginning. I told her that the Duke's reputation had survived his wife's very public infidelities, and it would survive this as well, because the truth was far less damning than the rumors she was threatening to spread. I told her that she could take her information to whomever she pleased, but that we would not be moved by her threats. She left in a fury, promising that we would regret our defiance, that the scandal she would create would make us wish we had accepted her terms. But as her carriage disappeared down the drive, I felt strangely calm. Whatever came next, we would face it together. That was what mattered. The Dowager Duchess summoned us to her rooms that afternoon. She looked even frailer than she had the week before, her skin nearly transparent and her breathing labored. But her eyes were bright when we entered, and she smiled to see us walking side by side, our fingers intertwined. She said that she had heard about Lady Victoria's visit and the confrontation that had followed, that the servants had carried the news to her as servants always did. She told Christian that she was proud of him, that telling the truth had taken more courage than she had known he possessed. She told him that his wife's death had been a tragedy, but that he had spent long enough punishing himself for being human, for failing to be perfect in an impossible moment. She told him that it was time to let go of the guilt and begin living again, really living, with the woman who had chosen to stand beside him despite everything. Then she told me that she had been right about me, that I had proven to be exactly the kind of duchess the family needed, strong and loyal and willing to see past surface judgments to the heart of things. She said that she could rest easy now, knowing that her grandson would not be alone, that he would have someone who truly cared for him rather than just wanting his title and fortune. She made us promise that we would take care of each other, that we would build a real marriage based on honesty and mutual support rather than social expectations and empty gestures. She said that she did not have much time left, perhaps a few weeks at most, and that she wanted to spend those weeks knowing that her interference, her manipulation, her insistence on this unlikely match had resulted in something good rather than in more pain. We promised her, both of us, and I could see tears in Christian's eyes as he held his grandmother's frail hand. She had raised him after his parents died young, had been the one constant presence in his life, and the thought of losing her clearly terrified him even if he would never admit it aloud. She told him that death was not something to fear, that she had lived a long and mostly good life, and that she was ready to rest. She told him to remember that love was worth the risk of pain, that closing himself off to protect his heart only meant dying slowly from loneliness. Over the next few weeks, Lady Victoria made good on her threats. Rumors began to circulate through society about the Duke's possible involvement in his late wife's death. Anonymous letters appeared in gossip columns suggesting that the death had not been as accidental as initially reported. Former friends and business associates began to distance themselves, declining invitations and making excuses to avoid being seen in our company. But Christian faced it all with a kind of calm determination I had not seen in him before. He published a full account of what had happened that night in a letter to the Times, holding nothing back, admitting his guilt in failing to act quickly, but also explaining the context of his wife's cruelty and betrayal. The letter caused a sensation, dividing society into those who condemned him and those who sympathized with his pain. But the honesty of it, the raw vulnerability of admitting his failings publicly, earned him respect even from some who disagreed with his actions. And through it all, we grew closer. Christian began coming to my rooms in the evenings, not to fulfill his duty as he had once threatened, but simply to talk. We spoke about everything and nothing, about his childhood and mine, about the losses we had survived and the fears we still carried. He told me stories about his grandmother, about happy memories from before his wife had destroyed his ability to trust. I told him about my father and my dreams for Rose's future, and my mother's slowly improving health. Gradually, cautiously, he began to let me see the man he had been before grief and betrayal had hardened him. He had a dry sense of humor that surprised me. He was surprisingly well-read and could discuss literature and philosophy with an enthusiasm that made his face light up. He cared deeply about his tenants and the people who worked on his estate, and he had been quietly using his fortune to improve their lives even during the worst of his isolation. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, physical intimacy began to develop between us. A hand held a little longer. A goodnight kiss that deepened into something more. The night he finally stayed in my rooms, finally made our marriage real in the physical sense, it was nothing like the cold, efficient transaction the Dowager Duchess had warned me to expect. It was tentative and awkward, and full of stops and starts as we learned each other, but it was also tender in a way that made my heart ache. He held me afterward like I was something precious, something he was afraid to break, and he whispered my name into the darkness like a prayer. The Dowager Duchess died 6 weeks after our wedding, slipping away peacefully in her sleep, with Christian holding one hand and me holding the other. Her funeral was well attended despite the scandal, proof that she had been loved and respected in ways that her grandson was only beginning to understand. At the wake, several older members of society approached Christian to tell him that his grandmother had spoken to them before her death, had told them about his marriage and about me, had asked them to give us a chance despite the rumors and the unconventional nature of our union. It became clear that she had been working behind the scenes all along, using her influence and her relationships to try to cushion the blow of the scandal she had known was coming. She had believed in us, had believed that what we could build together was worth protecting, and she had spent her final weeks trying to ensure that society would not destroy us before we had a chance to prove ourselves. One evening, perhaps 2 months after our wedding, Christian and I sat together in the library. I was reading while he worked on correspondence, a comfortable domestic scene that would have been unimaginable on our wedding day. He suddenly set down his pen and looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that made my breath catch. He said that he needed to tell me something, that he had been thinking about it for weeks and could not keep it inside any longer. He said that when he had told me on that cliff that he did not know how to love anyone anymore, he had believed it was true. But he said that over these past weeks, I had proven him wrong. He said that what he felt for me was not the desperate infatuation he had once mistaken for love with his first wife. It was something deeper and more solid, something built on respect and trust and genuine affection. He said that he loved me, not because I was beautiful or accomplished or because I enhanced his social position. He loved me because I had seen him at his absolute worst and had chosen to stay anyway. He loved me because I was kind and practical and stubborn enough to refuse to give up on him. He loved me because when he looked at me, he saw not just a wife but a partner, someone who made him want to be better than he was. I set down my book with trembling hands and crossed the room to where he sat. I knelt beside his chair and took his face in my hands and told him that I loved him too, that I had loved him almost from the beginning, that I had been terrified that he would never be able to return that love. I told him that these past weeks, watching him slowly open his heart to me, had been the most precious gift I had ever received. He pulled me into his lap and kissed me, not with the desperate passion of new lovers, but with the tender certainty of two people who had found something rare and worth protecting. We sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the fire burn down in the hearth, and I thought about how far we had come from that morning in his study when he had looked at me as if I were nothing. We still had challenges ahead of us. Society's judgment would not disappear overnight. There would be people who would always view our marriage as scandalous or inappropriate. But we had each other now, truly had each other, and that felt like enough to face whatever storms might come. I thought about the £5,000 he had given me, about how I had spent it on medicine and food and practical necessities, while others had bought jewels and gowns. I thought about how that choice had revealed something essential about who I was, something that he had recognized even when he was trying not to. And I realized that sometimes the most valuable things we can offer another person are not the beautiful or expensive things, but the simple, honest necessities that keep body and soul together. Christian had needed someone to see past his cold exterior to the wounded man beneath. He had needed someone who would not give up when things were difficult, who would stand beside him in scandal and judgment, who would believe he was worth saving even when he had stopped believing it himself. And I had needed someone who valued those qualities in me, who saw my care for my family not as a limitation, but as proof of my capacity for loyalty and love. We were an unlikely pair, the Duke and the Maid, who became his Duchess. But perhaps the best love stories were always unlikely, were always about two people who should not fit together, but somehow did, who found in each other exactly what they had been missing without even knowing they needed it. That night, as we climbed the stairs to our separate rooms, Christian stopped me with a hand on my arm. He asked if I would consider moving into his rooms, sharing his bed not just occasionally but permanently, making our marriage real in every sense. He said that he did not want to spend another night apart from me, that he had wasted too much time already in cold isolation when he could have been warm beside me. I agreed, my heart so full I could barely speak. And as I fell asleep that night in his arms, in the Duke's own bed where his first wife had slept and schemed and betrayed, I felt no jealousy or insecurity. I felt only gratitude that life had given us both a second chance, that tragedy and loss had not been the end of our stories, but merely the difficult middle chapters before we found each other. The road ahead would not be easy, but we would walk it together, the Duke and his common bride, proving to anyone who cared to watch that the most valuable things in life could not be bought with £5,000 or £5 million. They could only be built with time and trust, and the quiet, everyday choice to love someone, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And that, I had learned, was worth more than all the jewels and gowns and social approval in the world. Spring turned to summer, and with the changing seasons came changes in our lives that I could not have imagined in those early dark days of our marriage. The scandal that Lady Victoria had threatened to create did spread through society, but not in the way she had intended. Christian's honest account of that terrible night, published for all to read, had struck a chord with many who had suffered through difficult marriages, or who understood that human beings were complex creatures capable of both failure and redemption. There were still those who condemned him, of course, who said that a gentleman should have acted more quickly regardless of his emotional state, who whispered that perhaps there was more to the story than he had admitted. But there were also those who wrote letters of support, who called upon us to express their sympathy, who said that his honesty had been refreshing in a society built on maintaining polite fictions and hiding uncomfortable truths. Lady Victoria herself had overplayed her hand. In her fury at being rejected, she had made increasingly wild accusations that even her allies found difficult to believe. She claimed that Christian had deliberately frightened his wife's horse, that he had planned the entire incident, that he was a cold-blooded murderer who had manipulated everyone into believing his story. But she could produce no witnesses to support these claims, no evidence beyond her own spite and wounded pride, and eventually even the gossip columns tired of her dramatics. The last I heard of her, she had left England entirely, gone to the continent where her family had distant connections and where the scandal of her own behavior might be forgotten more easily than in London. I should have felt triumphant about her departure, but instead I felt only a vague sadness for a woman who had let bitterness and ambition consume whatever good qualities she might once have possessed. The real transformation in our lives came not from society's judgment or acceptance, but from the quiet daily work of building a real marriage. Christian and I settled into rhythms and routines that felt natural rather than forced. We took breakfast together every morning in the small dining room rather than the formal one, discussing the day's plans and whatever news had arrived with the morning post. We walked the estate grounds together in the afternoons when weather permitted, and he began teaching me about land management and tenant relations, treating me as a true partner in the work of maintaining the property rather than as a decorative accessory. He came with me to visit my mother and Rose, something I had never dared to ask, but which he offered on his own. That first visit had been awkward, my mother clearly uncertain how to address a duke in her tiny cottage, Rose struck speechless with awe at the elegant stranger who was now her brother-in-law. But Christian had sat at our scarred wooden table and drunk weak tea from chipped cups and spoken to my mother with genuine respect about her health and her garden and her memories of my father. By the end of the visit, my mother was calling him Christian rather than Your Grace, and Rose had overcome enough of her shyness to ask him about the horses at the manor. He arranged for Rose to receive proper education, hiring a governess who came to our cottage 3 times a week to teach her reading and writing and mathematics and all the things that might give her opportunities beyond what her birth had promised. He said that intelligence and curiosity should be nurtured regardless of social class, and that Rose deserved the same chances that daughters of wealthy families received as a matter of course. Watching him interact with my family, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed them, made me love him even more deeply than I already did. This was not the cold, bitter man who had stood at the altar barely able to look at me on our wedding day. This was someone who had been slowly thawing, slowly remembering how to be warm and kind and open to connection. Our physical relationship had deepened as well, becoming something that felt essential rather than dutiful. I had been nervous at first, uncertain of what he expected or what I should do, my only education in such matters coming from the Dowager Duchess's clinical explanations and whispered gossip among servants. But Christian had been patient and careful, treating me as if I were something precious that needed gentle handling. He taught me that intimacy could be about connection rather than just physical release, that the vulnerability of being close to another person in that way could build trust rather than just satisfy desire. There were still difficult days, of course. Days when his old grief would rise up unexpectedly and he would withdraw into himself, becoming distant and cold in ways that reminded me painfully of our early days together. Days when I would feel overwhelmed by the responsibilities of being a duchess, when I would make mistakes in managing the household or dealing with visitors and would feel exposed as the imposter I feared I truly was. But we had learned to talk through these difficult moments rather than letting them fester into larger wounds. One evening in late summer, Christian found me in the library staring at correspondence I did not know how to answer. A duchess from a neighboring county had written asking if I would join her charitable committee, and I was paralyzed by fear that I would embarrass both myself and Christian by accepting. He read the letter over my shoulder, then sat beside me and took my hand. He told me that he understood my fear, that he knew I worried constantly about not being good enough for the position you found yourself in. But he said that I had already proven myself in ways that mattered far more than knowing which fork to use at dinner or how to phrase a social acceptance. He said that I cared about people, truly cared about them, in ways that most of the aristocracy had forgotten how to do. He said that the charitable work would benefit enormously from having someone who understood what poverty actually looked like rather than viewing it as an abstract concept to be discussed at tea parties. He helped me compose a response accepting the invitation, and he accompanied me to my first committee meeting to provide moral support. The other women had been coolly polite at first, clearly skeptical about the Duke's common bride joining their ranks. But when we discussed the conditions in the village workhouse, I was able to speak from actual knowledge rather than vague sympathy. I knew what it was like to be hungry, to be cold, to live with the constant fear of becoming desperate enough to need charity. And something in my voice, some authenticity they could not question, slowly won them over. By autumn, I had become genuinely involved in charitable work throughout the county, visiting workhouses and schools and almshouses with Christian beside me. We used our money and influence to make real improvements in people's lives, to provide opportunities and support that had not existed before. It was deeply satisfying work, more satisfying than any amount of social success could have been, and it gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond simply being Christian's wife. My mother's health had stabilized with continued good medicine and proper nutrition, though the doctor warned that her lungs would always be fragile and that she must be careful not to overexert herself. Christian had offered repeatedly to have her move into the manor where she could be properly cared for, but she refused, saying that she was too old to live in a grand house and too set in her ways to be comfortable being waited on. Instead, we arranged for a woman from the village to come daily to help with the heavy work, and I visited at least 3 times a week to make sure she was well. Rose had blossomed under her education, proving to have a quick mind and an even temper that endeared her to everyone who met her. She was 17 now, no longer the frightened child who had watched me leave for the manor each morning, wondering if we would have enough to eat. Christian had quietly established a dowry for her, enough that she could marry respectably when the time came. And several local young men had already begun paying attention to the pretty, educated sister of the Duchess. On our first wedding anniversary, Christian arranged a private dinner in the small dining room, just the 2 of us with candles and flowers, and the kind of thoughtful touches that showed he had been planning it for weeks. Over wine and courses I could barely taste because I was too aware of his eyes on me, too conscious of the weight of everything we had survived together. He gave me a gift that made tears spring to my eyes. It was a painting commissioned in secret of our cottage. Not as it had been when I lived there, with its sagging roof and peeling paint and air of desperate poverty, but as it was now, repaired and maintained and surrounded by the garden my mother tended. The artist had captured it in late afternoon light, warm and golden and full of quiet dignity, transforming what had once been a symbol of our poverty into something that looked almost beautiful. Christian told me that he had wanted me to have a reminder of where I came from, not because he thought I might forget, but because he never wanted me to feel ashamed of it. He said that the cottage and my family and my humble origins were part of what made me who I was, part of what he loved about me. He said that the greatest privilege of his life was not being born a duke, but being chosen by someone who saw past the title to the broken man underneath and decided he was worth loving anyway. I cried then, unable to hold back the tears that had been building all evening. I told him that I'd been so afraid on our wedding day, so certain that I had made a terrible mistake, so convinced that he would never be able to see me as anything more than an obligation. I told him that watching him slowly open his heart to me had been like watching spring arrive after a long, harsh winter, gradual and uncertain at first, but eventually undeniable in its warmth. He pulled me into his arms and held me while I cried. His own eyes wet with tears, he no longer tried to hide from me. He said that his first wife had taught him to guard his heart, to view every expression of emotion as a potential weakness to be exploited. But I had taught him that vulnerability could be a kind of strength, that letting someone see your broken places was not an invitation for them to hurt you, but an opportunity for them to help you heal. We made love that night with a tenderness and certainty that came from truly knowing each other, from having survived difficulties together and emerged stronger rather than shattered. And afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, I thought about how impossible this all would have seemed a year ago. How far we had both traveled from that morning in his study when he had first looked at me and seen nothing but an inconvenient test his grandmother had forced upon him. Winter came again, bringing with it the social season and the inevitable invitations to balls and dinners and house parties. We attended some of these events, presenting ourselves as a united front, proving to society that our marriage was real and solid despite its unconventional beginnings. There were still those who whispered behind their fans, still those who made it clear they found our union distasteful. But there were also those who treated us with genuine warmth, who said that they admired our partnership, who told me privately that they envied what Christian and I had built together. At one particularly grand ball in London, I found myself cornered by a group of young women who wanted to know how I had managed to capture a duke's heart. They asked in voices that mixed curiosity with envy, clearly viewing our marriage as some kind of calculated achievement rather than the messy, complicated reality it actually was. I told them honestly that I had not captured anything, that love was not about strategy or manipulation, but about seeing another person clearly and choosing them anyway. I told them that the most valuable thing I had offered Christian was not beauty or accomplishments, but simply the willingness to stand beside him when things were difficult. They looked disappointed by this answer, as if they had been hoping for some secret technique they could apply to their own matrimonial ambitions. But one young woman, quieter than the rest, caught my arm as I moved away and thanked me for my honesty. She said that too many people treated marriage as a business transaction or a social advancement, and that it was refreshing to hear someone speak about it as if feelings actually mattered. In the spring following our first anniversary, I discovered I was pregnant. I had suspected for some weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until I was certain, not wanting to raise Christian's hopes only to disappoint him. When I finally told him, sitting together in the garden on a warm afternoon, he went very still and quiet in a way that frightened me. I asked if he was displeased, if the thought of becoming a father again after his first wife's betrayals was too painful. He shook his head slowly, then pulled me close and buried his face in my hair. He said that he was overwhelmed, that he had not let himself hope for this, that the thought of having a child with me, a child born from love rather than duty, was almost more happiness than he knew how to process. He said that he was also terrified that he would fail this child the way he felt he had failed in so many other ways, terrified that his darkness might somehow taint the innocent life we were creating together. I told him that he would not fail, that I had seen him with Rose and with the children on his estate, and that he was capable of great gentleness when he let himself be. I told him that we would figure out parenthood together the same way we had figured out marriage, one day at a time, with patience and honesty and the willingness to admit when we needed help. I told him that our child would be lucky to have a father who cared so deeply about doing right by them, even if that caring came wrapped in fear. The pregnancy progressed normally, though I was often tired and occasionally sick in ways that made me grateful for the comfort and care that surrounded me now. Christian was endlessly solicitous, bringing me tea and books and sitting with me during the long afternoons when I was too exhausted to do anything but rest. My mother and Rose visited often, bringing food from their garden and stories from the village, their presence a reminder that I was still Margaret, even if I was also now the Duchess of Ashford. Our daughter was born on a cold December morning, exactly 1 week before what would have been the second anniversary of our wedding. The birth was difficult and frightening, lasting nearly 20 hours and leaving me exhausted and shaken. But when they finally placed her in my arms, tiny and red and screaming with the outrage of being thrust into the cold world, I felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took my breath away. Christian stood beside the bed with tears streaming down his face, looking at our daughter as if she were a miracle he had not believed possible. He reached out to touch her tiny hand, and when her fingers curled around his in instinctive reflex, something in his expression broke open in a way I had never seen before. He looked at me, and then at her, and said in a voice rough with emotion that he had not known it was possible to feel this much, to love this deeply, to be this terrified and this grateful all at once. We named her Eleanor, after Christian's grandmother, who had brought us together through her stubborn faith in unlikely possibilities. She had her father's gray eyes and my dark hair and a remarkably strong grip for someone so small. Watching Christian hold her, seeing the tender, careful way he cradled her against his chest, I knew that whatever fears he had about being a father would not prevent him from being a good one. My mother came to meet her granddaughter, bringing Rose with her, and we sat together in my room while Eleanor slept in her cradle. My mother held my hand and told me that she was proud of me, not for becoming a duchess or for making a good marriage, but for staying true to myself through everything that had happened. She said that I had retained the kindness and the practicality that had always defined me, even as I had learned to navigate a world so different from the one I had grown up in. Rose, holding Eleanor with careful reverence, asked me if I was happy. It was such a simple question, but it made me pause and really consider my answer. I told her that I was happier than I had ever imagined being, that the life I had now felt both surreal and exactly right. I told her that happiness was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of people worth struggling for, worth building with, worth loving even when that love was complicated and messy and hard. As winter deepened and then slowly gave way to another spring, Christian and I settled into the rhythms of parenthood. We were fortunate enough to have nurses and help, but we also insisted on being involved in Eleanor's daily care in ways that were unusual for people of our station. Christian would wake in the night when she cried, would walk the floors with her, would sing to her in a voice that was rough but surprisingly sweet. I nursed her myself rather than hiring a wet nurse, wanting that connection with my daughter even though it was considered somewhat vulgar for a duchess to do so. We had come so far from that morning in Christian's study, when he had looked at me with cold assessment, and I had stood before him in my maid's dress, wondering what impossible test he intended to put me through. We had survived scandal and judgment and our own private demons. We had learned to trust each other, to be vulnerable with each other, to build something real and solid that no amount of social disapproval could shake. One evening in late spring, as we sat together watching Eleanor sleep in her cradle, Christian took my hand and told me something that made my heart soar. He said that he had been thinking about the test his grandmother had designed, about the 5,000 pounds and the question of what each woman would choose to buy. He said that he understood now why I had passed when the others had failed. The other women had spent their money on things that enhanced their own value, on beauty and elegance and social position. They had invested in themselves as commodities, as objects to be admired and desired. But I had spent the money on other people, on my family's survival and well-being, on the quiet, unglamorous necessities that kept people alive and safe. And in doing so, I had revealed something essential about my character, something his grandmother had seen, but that he himself had been too wounded to recognize at first. He said that true love was not about what someone could do for you or how they made you look to others. True love was about caring for another person's welfare more than your own comfort, about making sacrifices without keeping score, about building something together that was stronger than what either person could create alone. He said that I had been showing him this kind of love since the day I stood up to him in our wedding night, refusing to accept his coldness and demanding that he see me as a real person rather than as an unwanted burden. I told him that he had taught me things as well, that watching him slowly learn to trust again had shown me that no one was beyond redemption, that even the most broken hearts could heal if given enough time and patience and gentle care. I told him that I was grateful for every difficult moment we had survived together because those moments had taught us how to be partners rather than just spouses, how to support each other rather than simply coexist. We had built something precious from the most unlikely materials, a grieving widower and a poor maid brought together by an old woman's dying wish and 5,000 pounds spent on medicine and bread. We had survived scandal and judgment and our own worst instincts. We had learned to love each other, not despite our flaws and differences, but in some strange way because of them. Because those very flaws and differences had made us capable of understanding what the other person truly needed. As I looked around the room at my sleeping daughter, at my husband whose hand held mine with such warmth and certainty, at the life we had built together from such broken beginnings, I thought about that morning in the Duke's study and the impossible choice I had made. I had spent 5,000 pounds on saving my family, on practical necessities rather than beautiful luxuries, and in return I had received something I could never have bought at any price. I had found love, real love, the kind that grew slowly from respect and trust, and the willingness to see another person's brokenness and choose them anyway, the kind that survived difficulties and emerged stronger, the kind that made every sacrifice worthwhile and every hard moment bearable. I had found a home, not just in this grand manor with its beautiful rooms and elegant furnishings, but in Christian's arms, in the family we were building together, in the knowledge that I was seen and valued and cherished for exactly who I was. I had found purpose and partnership and the kind of happiness that came not from having everything, but from having exactly what mattered most. The Duke of Ashford had tested 4 women with 5,000 pounds, and I had passed his test by failing to understand it was a test at all. I had simply done what I always did, what I had learned to do through years of poverty and struggle and loving people who needed me. I had cared for those who could not care for themselves. I had chosen necessity over luxury, love over vanity, substance over appearance. And in the end, that choice had given me everything I had ever wanted and everything I had never dared to dream of. It had given me a husband who loved me, a daughter who made every moment precious, a family that spanned the gulf between nobility and poverty to prove that what truly mattered had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. It had given me a life that felt both impossible and inevitable, like I had always been meant to end up exactly here, in this moment, with these people. Christian leaned over to kiss me, gentle and certain, and I kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and wonder that filled my heart. Outside our window, spring was in full bloom, the gardens alive with color and promise. And inside our home, in this room filled with warmth and love and the quiet breathing of our sleeping child, we had built our own kind of garden, planted in unlikely soil, but growing into something beautiful, despite everything that might have prevented it. The test was over. The judge had become the judged, the tester had become the tested, and we had both learned that the most valuable things in life could not be bought or sold or won through cleverness or strategy. They could only be built day by day with honesty and vulnerability and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other, even when giving up would have been easier. We had built a love story from the most unlikely materials, and it was ours, entirely and completely ours, worth more than all the £5,000 in the world.